So percussion is one of those areas of contemporary music or just music in general that can be such a foreign language to composers in particular who aren't familiar with it. And it can definitely be overwhelming given the wide array of timbres and textures that can be achieved with so many different varieties of instruments. Do you have any tips that can help those who don't know a whole lot about how to write for percussion and what sort of steps they can take to make what they write feel idiomatic and natural to a percussionist?
Show their music to a percussionist.
Sure.
Yeah, for
but
sure.
but if you're going to start off, right, like if you don't know what's possible, like what's the first point that you give to somebody that's not a percussionist to say, how do I know what to do?
I feel like most often when people are first writing for percussion, they see like the massive volume of options, right? And they try to like throw a bunch of cool things in there, and I don't think that's a good way to go about it. I think even though it might be kind of challenging to show restraint and just pick a few instruments or one instrument maybe even, if you did that, a composer could get much more feedback as to like what was successful or not with that given instrument, and then you can start finding out how they pair it. But I think a lot of times I see, like when I was in school and you'd work with, freshman composing students, they would oftentimes just write for a ton of gear and nothing is actually being utilized well. It's just kind of like sounds for the sake of sounds. And I mean, it's
very
not like
there's sinky.
Yeah, and it's not that there's not positive intent behind it. I just think you need to learn what each instrument is capable of, and you can go down the extended techniques rabbit hole, but honestly, I would say just try to keep it the way the instrument's traditionally played, and then if you really are like, this is missing something, try to find some way to use those techniques to achieve it instead of just having like a massive tapestry of sounds for the sake of sounds.
Yeah, I think one of the other things I think we encounter sometimes, not all the time, but I think we've all had these experiences where you come across a piece, and there's a new music ensemble in Portland that we've all played with, and I'm recalling a concert that I was involved with this piece, this large scale piece we were doing, and very good composer, and actually he had written this percussion part intending it for one player, but it was like, if you imagine sort of like your standard orchestra setup with everything on stage. I mean, it was like timpani, marimba, xylophone, vibes, chimes, Glock, xylophone, bass drum, cymbal. It was like the entire symphonic section plus like multi-setup. And so you're looking at this piece going like, actually this is really cool stuff, but this is like 3 players. This isn't. So I think one of the things sometimes even really good composers forget about is the actual physicality of what it takes to move physically through space to get from one instrument to the next, and what's possible with that and what's not, because sometimes it's literally physically impossible to
or the physical demands impede the possibilities of the music, right? The intention of the music. It's like, right, this could be a great phrase, but it's broken in half because I have to do this insane.
This was one of those situations. The piece I'm recalling was a situation where, for instance, it'd be like, okay, play this phrase on marimba, and then you have 4 counts to go to timpani. It's like, okay, no problem. But then later in the piece, it'd be like, play this phrase on vibes, and then you have 2 counts to go to timpani, and then the same thing with everything else. And so there was no logistical way to set everything else up to make all the transitions work. So I think sometimes just putting yourself in the shoes of the player to make sure that, like, okay, is somebody actually going to be able to do this?
Just purely from a physical perspective,
yeah.
Not even
And then idiomatically, like, right, I mean, I think Paul hit the nail on the head. It's, a lot of times right now, especially the percussion instruments are seen as just like this playing field for extended techniques, right? And we love doing that stuff, and it can add a lot. But actually, I mean, I think about even some of our favorite pieces that we play. Rain Tree comes to mind, and there's really nothing in the way of extended techniques in that piece at all, but it's like one of the best pieces ever written.
It just got to be the intent behind it. It's extended techniques are great when used for good and not evil, and I just think that people don't know the difference between it sometimes.
And then logistics too. I mean, I've seen pieces where composers have written for 8 pairs of bongos. It's like, where am I going to find 8 pairs of bongos?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, you can do it, but you got to consider that.
Yeah, and I think young composers. I'm a composer, and what I did when I wrote for non-percussion is I'd go find a clarinet player and say, okay, what are your favorite notes to play? What kind of things are fun to play? What range? The book says you can do this range, but what range can you actually do that sounds good? And they should do that with the percussionist, you know, say, is this possible to play on the marimba? And we'll go, yeah. We're like, no, no.
Sure, no, absolutely.
I think also from the standpoint of trying to make the whole percussion world seem less vast and less intimidating, would be to think of categorizing based on timbre and say, okay, this is a good section for a wood sound or a metallic sound, or here's a membranophone, right? So just try to like lump things into groups, and then, you know, to start, and then obviously you can get under the hood a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. Is there any kind of trend, because there are clearly percussion, whether percussion pieces or percussion in a modern chamber ensemble, where your gear list is massive. There's just so much kitchen sinky kind of stuff. And then I think that some points, some composers are very sensitive to that and trying to make the schlep part of it as minimal as possible. Do you see like a trend of that over time? Are people doing less now or more now, or is it just more random because of the style of the composer or the style of the time period? Or
it seems random to me.
I think it's all over the map.
Yeah.
I think it's all over the place. You know, I do think there is, lately it seems that there is maybe a bit of a move toward, you know, small instruments. You know, I'm thinking about even some of the stuff we've done recently, you know, the Jury Seau's pieces. You know, she's doing this whole series of things for like tiny instruments, basically, like handheld stuff. And there's some others doing that too, I think. So yeah, there might be a little bit of a trend with you know, can we use things that are like little and get away from relying on all the traditional, you know, all the
big
traditional
gongs and big bass drums.
Yeah, exactly. I think you know, the maximalist sort of approach to some of the percussion writing isn't quite as trendy right now.
Like people aren't doing Neil Peart style drum sets anymore, like that power metal like 25-piece drum set kind of thing anymore in general.
Well,
Just Terry.
Yeah.
Mr.
But
Bosey.
as far as the like if it's random or not, I do think it's kind of random, but I think it probably has to do more with what these I'm going to call them composition students, but composers, or specifically more like young composers, are being taught, right? I mean, if you want your piece to get played, somebody needs to tell you that if you write for two small instruments, people are going to want to play that because it's easier to obtain. You can travel with it easily. If you're at a school and the percussion department is tight with the composition department, there's going to be a much more educated composers as to what makes things possible and playable and desirable as a percussionist. Whereas if there's, say, a complete, complete cut off, complete disconnect, that they won't learn those things.
And if you have a composer professor too that just says the gamut is there, like if they love to explore that stuff in as wide a range as possible, then they'll impart that to their students. Then all of a sudden they're all writing for as many things as possible just to experiment and try those things out. Yeah, that makes sense.
But you just got to know what people are, what's actually available to them, right? If you want to write for everything, you got to find somebody who's willing to take the time to put all that gear together, because that actually is a real thing, but also has the access to it. And that's one of the hardest things about playing percussion music is like, oh, I would love to play this, but I need a 36-inch timpano, which is a super specialized instrument that doesn't even exist within 100 miles,
Right.
So I think a lot of that comes down to intent too, because, when we were just talking about Zanaka's, the Pleiad the other day and pieces like that. I mean, if you look at the instrumentation, it's pretty vast. There's a lot involved, but the intent behind it is so clear. It's kind of, is the juice worth the squeeze kind of thing, right? And
right.
So
absolutely.
sometimes we'll play big pieces, and it's like, well, yeah, it's worth it because in the end, like, the music is worth it to go through that.
Yeah.
That's what you don't want is stuff that's just you have more of more just for the sake of more. And if it doesn't mean anything, then it's not more, actually. Yeah,
which is true compositionally to some degree too. Like
for
the
sure.
idea of for me, like complexity for the sake of complexity.
Absolutely.
Like if the end effect doesn't seem complex, but notationally it is complex for no real reason, but just to kind of make it look more academically sound. That's something that really turns me off about compositions.
I always tell composition students, your job is to make it as easy as possible for the players to convey the thoughts and sounds. You know, if a student hands me a piece and says, "Ha, let's see if you can play that," I'll turn around and go, "Ha, no." You know, and I think, you know, also to get back to the whole, you know, so many instruments, I think depending on where you go to school, it plays a really big part, because, you know, I was a composition student as an undergrad, and I knew that if I wrote a piece for 5-octave marimbas, I need to be able to find them. If my school only had one, I'm like, okay, I can write a piece that has 1 5-octave, you know? Even though my composition teacher would say, don't write for a player, don't write for what's there, write what's in your mind. But when you write a piece for flute, a flute player has a flute. You write a piece for percussion, I don't own all percussion or have access to all of it, you know? I mean, that's what's so cool about the percussion communities. We share with each other.
Yeah.
You know, like, I got a 5, you don't, okay, cool, I'll share that, but you've got timpani, can I borrow your timpani? Type of situation where I don't see other instruments doing that, you know? Like, can I borrow your saxophone? No. It's
Right.
mine.
Yeah, right, totally. nienteForte is celebrating its landmark 10th season, sponsored by the National Performance Network. You can join us in championing contemporary music in New Orleans with a tax-deductible donation. Donating can get you some great perks, including early access to these roundtables, signed posters and programs from our featured performers, signed music scores from our featured composers, and even custom handwritten miniature compositions from composers in the nienteForte community. For more information, go to nienteForte.com/donate.